Hi, my name is Jen Gabi. I'm here with Research for the Front Lines. Welcome to the first of 2 trainings this summer on communicating for radical transformation, put on by Research for the Front Lines. Research for the Front Lines, just quickly, is a network of folks from universities and other places across so-called Canada who support the research needs of communities and movements fighting for environmental justice and climate justice across the country. So we support community-led research in many different ways, and this training series is part of that. So welcome. Hi, how's it going? Good. So we would like to thank you all for being here. I'd like to especially thank the Research for the Frontline volunteers who are so committed to skilling up and getting better at serving communities on the front lines of these struggles. So thanks for being here. I'd like to thank our awesome partners. We have several partners who've made this event happen, including Concordia's Social Justice Center, Concordia Shift Center for Social Transformation, and University of Ottawa's Laboratory for Engaged Research. So that's who is supporting this. And of course, I would also thank Tom Lashus and Kenzie Harris, our 2 trainers today from the Grassroots Global Support Network. Okay, we're unmuted now. So I would like to, just a couple of things. I'd like to acknowledge that here in Montreal, we're on unceded Kainai-Gahaga territory. I personally am coming in today from Abenaki territory in rural Quebec. So let's keep that in mind. Also, let's keep in mind that if you're joining by Zoom today, to keep muted except when you want to speak up or ask a question. So stay muted, and there will be time for conversation. But for now, I'll hand it over to Kenzie.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Kenzie. I guess we'll just quickly introduce ourselves. So I use she, they pronouns. I'm the principal coordinator at the Global Grassroots Support Network. We're a network and community of practice that brings together groups and individuals that support grassroots activists. And we share knowledge and resources to try to solve for the challenges that come up in support work. I'm also a librarian and trainer at Le Hub. And I gained the skills that we're presenting today in my graduate studies, so I'm really excited to share them with all of you. And I've been expanding on them in my work and in my activism as well. So I'll just swap seats with Tom briefly to introduce himself. Getting used to it.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tom Lachas. Happy to be here with you all. I use he, him pronouns. And well, done a bunch of things in my career, but relevant to today's conversation, I did a master's at one point in my life, so I remember what academia and research looks like. But I also helped found 3 different knowledge exchange projects for activists and campaigners, Blueprints for Change, a collaborative guide creating group that we'll be talking about, the Climate Justice Organizing Hub, which is across Canada now, and the Global Grassroots Support Network, where I work with Kenzie. So we'll be drawing from those case studies today, and really happy to be exchanging with you all.
Swap again.
Are you ready for me to share screen with slides? Or?
Sure, yeah, that'd be great. I'll just be sitting in this chair quite briefly, actually, but I guess just, yeah, a couple of housekeeping notes. If you do have questions, you can leave them in the chat. If you're joining online, in person, you can just raise your hand. Any accessibility needs, if they come up at any point for you, just let us know, again, in the chat or raise your hand. And yeah, we can get started with that.
Oh.
Yeah. Sorry. Next slide, please.
Oh, the slides are not switching. Please hold. Okay, I think they just freeze a little bit and it's been sitting for a while. Sorry. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, so just to review the format briefly, we'll do some talking. You'll have to listen to us for a bit. And then we will quickly move into some practice of the first skill that we learn. We'll do some more talking. We'll take a break somewhere at the halfway point. We'll practice some more. We'll have a point where we can do some brainstorming for folks who are part of the Research for the Front Lines group. If you're not, you can just think about it on your own. And then we'll summarize everything that we learned. So if that sounds good, we can move in and I will swap seats with Tom, who will get started.
Thanks, Jen. So we wanted to kick things off with just some big picture ideas around how knowledge transfer for community development folks and activists differs from academic research, or just what some of the pivots that are required to translate one knowledge to the other kind of knowledge. And one of these, having been in both of these worlds, as I've said, there's a difference in what we anchor knowledge in and where we build trust and credibility around knowledge in community development and activism. And also a kind of hurdle that academic researchers need to get over when bridging to other communities, that being that, the book knowledge that we're trying to bring to these sectors is applicable, on the streets or in real life. So one of the things that's really valued in community development and activist knowledge transfer is experience. Lived experience trumps any other kind of status that you might bring into the work as somebody bringing knowledge to these sectors. So there's two parts of this. One is that, the people that we draw knowledge from, we often seek to center folks who have very direct lived experience applying the knowledge that we're talking about. And so here I've just pulled an example from Blueprints for Change. Blueprints for Change would put together guides on different activist tactics and strategies, and essentially draw from multiple experiences of folks who had rolled these things out in real life, and try to put together them in such a way that these could be replicable by other groups and campaigners. But the attribution section was always super important and was always carefully looked at by activists and campaigners, just to see, all right, who are we talking about? Whose knowledge are we talking about here? Is this worth my time? And so it had to be very explicit that, okay, this is from these people who are well-known practitioners of the thing that we're talking about, and also the movements that they were involved in. So, as you can see, this is taken from a guide on distributed organizing, which is a tactic to scale up by sparking remote groups at a distance around a cause or movement. And the people that have been sourced or sources of knowledge here are clearly indicated. And we often would link to their social profiles, so you could also see what their track record or history is as an activist. So all this it wasn't just done for fun. It was actually a necessity to do this so that people could see that this is real stuff coming from real lived experience. Move on to the next slide.
It's frozen again.
Right.
Sorry.
I'll just
Yes.
start introing as we figure that out. So this is just like another face of the same issue, and that is that whenever something is explicitly drawn from lived experience, it's often highlighted in documents of community development or activist knowledge exchange. It's highlighted because it brings credibility, but also to in a sense give credit to folks who actually lived this and brought their lived experience, contributed it for the greater good of others who could learn from it. So here's an example from our Climate Justice Organizing Hub wiki, which has tons of articles on very practical and tactical mobilization strategies. And in this case, as in many articles there, we started with an initial base of knowledge that came from research and maybe third-party sources, and editors like Kenzie, who put together a lot of the wiki content, would write it up. But then we would hold learning circles where activists who had experience with this tactic would come and share in their lived experiences of doing this and add a lot of nuances to that. And their pieces and their testimony would be reproduced within these guides to enrich them, but they would be highlighted as real live lived experience knowledge that's baked into the guide. So hope that helps us think a little bit about how, you know, credit happens differently and credit and credibility happen differently in the activist knowledge transfer setting. And with that, I will switch chairs with Kenzie.
Okay, hopefully the next slide
Yeah.
doesn't freeze on us here.
It didn't.
Haha, okay. So accessible and actionable writing in a nutshell is communication that your audience understands the first time that they read or hear it and that they have a use for. So your information should be easy to find, understand, use, and it should meet the needs of your audience. So academic language poses a lot of benefits, but it does privilege those that have access to higher education. So we really need to think about how we can make sure that those who have not been able to access that can access what we have to share. So I like to think about a member of my family, or in particular, something that's really helpful is if you know like a middle schooler or an early high schooler, if you tried to share with them what you're trying to share, whether it be a report or whatever it is you're working on, if they would have a really difficult time understanding those main points, how could you rephrase that? How could you think about explaining it in a way that they would understand? What types of terms would you have to maybe explain to them, because maybe they're outside of said circle, things like that. So on average, people in so-called Canada are reading at the 8th to 9th grade level approximately. This does vary, and we could potentially critique how that was determined, but it does make for a good marker. So writing at about an 8th grade level is a great point to try to reach, because it ensures that your writing is engaging and understandable to the general public, but also that it's comfortable to those who can read at higher reading levels. Also, not everyone has the attention span to read through a really complex multi-page report. So they want to be able to read and understand your main takeaways and how they can use your findings in as little time as possible. And I can definitely speak to that. We're good for the next slide. So the first principle to put this into action is to make things easy to find. So there's 5 kind of key things that you can think about when we're making things easy to find. So the first thing, and this is kind of the easiest way to make things easy to find, is to use bolding. So underlining and italics are great, but for other purposes, use bolding for your main takeaways. Headings are great when possible. It really helps to break up sections and makes it easy to go back and find particular things if people want to reference something. Lists and tables are also really great to show information in a different way. It's really great for the eye to just get a break from really heavy paragraphs. And graphics, when they're appropriate, can also be really helpful, again, to emphasize key ideas and to just give the eye something different to look at. And another really important point is to use blank space. It is your friend. We have a tendency to want to put as much information as possible in a very little space, most of us. And unfortunately, that makes it really hard for you to find those main ideas. So avoid putting text over a photo. Less is more. Blank space is certainly your friend. And so with that, if you can believe it, we're already going to move into a practice. So on the next slide, we have a text that I pulled about wildfires. I just Googled it because wildfires were happening. So it is literally just a random text, but it's a great reference to give this a try. I will say it's probably a bit complex, the language, but for the purposes, let's just think about formatting. So for this practice, if you would like to use your computer, your notes app, whatever you'd like, just jot down ideas on how you might reformat this, whatever is useful to you. I have included at the bottom those 5 points that you can remember in terms of formatting this. But yeah, just think about how you would make it easy to find the main points, the main takeaways that people might want to look back on. We'll take about 2 minutes and then, or maybe 1 minute, and come back together. Okay, now before I switch to my examples, I am not a graphic designer, so this is easily my weakest point in all of the skills that we'll learn. So I imagine that some of you probably have way better ideas than I did, but just in the most simplest way, I'll show you 2 examples of how you may have done something like this. So on the next slide, we have one simple way of doing it. So just breaking it up into lists, bullet points. It's really easy to find. If you just want to know the physical health effects, you can find those. You just want to know mental health effects, you can find those. There's clearly a title at the top. Again, I'm sure people have way better ideas than this, but some of you may have thought about like using lists or something to make it easier to read. And on the next slide, don't look at the photos that I used too much. Okay. But so just solely for the ideas sake, you could also use something like photos to emphasize each point. It's going to be a lot easier to remember, okay, yes, a mental health effect is substance abuse because I see a photo of a substance. Please don't look at the photos too much, but you can see that, you know, on a brochure or something like that, it might be useful to include pictures to really emphasize key points that you want people to remember. So I hope that you had better ideas than I did. But with that, we can move into the second principle, which is making information easy to understand. And there's quite a few pieces here that we should think about. So the first thing that we can think about is simplifying. So using as few words as possible is really, really helpful. So we have a couple examples, more practice here if you want to think about how we might shorten or replace a couple of the examples that we have here. So the word disseminate, for example, is a word that we love in academia, and there are easier ways to say disseminate. So I don't know if anyone in the chat maybe or in this room can think of another word for disseminate. Spread. Yeah. Share, yeah. So most people know those words. Some people might not know disseminate. Another example is was comprised of. So does anyone have another word that we could use for was comprised of? Congrats to the people who are getting this right in the chat.
Contains, made of.
Yeah.
I'm reading it in the chat.
Yeah.
Consists of.
Yeah. Applause. Sorry, all we have is applause for a prize. And the last example we have, and we're going to do a couple more of these actually, but provide assistance with. What's another word for that? Help. Yeah. So look for these in your writing because chances are you will have a lot of these that can be shortened. And we're going to do a couple more of these in the practice round because they're actually a lot of fun as well. So second, don't be ambiguous. So don't have hidden meanings, don't use idioms. If you're using an acronym, always spell it out the first time. It can be useful as well if you have a multi-page thing. If you'd like, you can spell it out a second time, but if it is referenced somewhere at the top in a table of contents, usually fine. But definitely spell out acronyms so folks know what you're talking about.
Oh, perfect.
We just had a new joiner. Hi, really. And once we're good, we'll move on to the next slide.
Why does it happen?
It's okay, I can get started while we're.
Yeah.
So thirdly, using short sentences and paragraphs is really helpful. So if you'd like a rule of thumb, keep your sentences below 15 to 20 words if you can. That's kind of a good benchmark. And paragraphs should be usually no more than about 5 lines. Obviously, you can give and take a little bit there. I do know that there's, and I do this too, there's a lot of hesitancy to separate sentences into 2 sentences, but it does help brains that can't maybe process as much in one go. So a simple period can actually really be helpful for people to get that break, to absorb the information, and then move on to the next sentence. Fourthly, use an active voice. So when possible. So in an active voice, the sentence's subject performs the action on the action's target. When you're in a passive voice, the target of the action is the main focus and the verb acts upon the subject. So we have a couple examples here. In the first example, I love ABBA. Lightning is actually the subject and ABBA is the target, because the subject is performing an action on the target. And then in the passive version, you'll see that the target is first. Obviously, there's times when it might not be appropriate to use an active voice, but generally, if you can, it is simpler and more clear. So we do see this in the second example, and this is more of a research sentence, if you will. So passively, we can say a study, so that's your target, was conducted, verb, by our team, sorry, which is a subject. And then in the active version, we say we, which is your main focus, the subject, conducted, verb, a study. So in sum, you want the main focus of your sentence, where possible, usually to go first in the sentence. And we'll move on to 5. There's a lot of these in the easy to understand section. So conversational pronouns can be really helpful. It makes things more actionable for people. So using things like we, you, us, it does make it, easier to use the information or feel like you know how to apply it. Using everyday words. So research terms in particular, or any other complex term might not be accessible for many people. So if you will lose meaning by not including them, obviously we do have terms that we need to include, just make sure that you explain them. And welcome contractions. So this is definitely different from academic language. So instead of saying do not, you would say don't. Instead of cannot, you could say can't. So with that, we're gonna do some practice.
Next slide.
Yes. So for this practice, we have some long phrases. Again, this is my favorite practice. And then we have some shorter phrases on the right-hand side. So we'll take about 2 minutes. Again, you can do this how you'd like, if you'd like to write them down or just think about them on your own. And we'll come together and we'll, just match the long phrase and the short form, and we'll see how you do. Okay, we had a lot of fun with this in Montreal, in the Montreal room here. So on the next slide, it's kind of messy, but you'll see how these match up. So we have a number of, many, owning to the fact that, because, at the present time, now, in a timely manner, promptly, quickly, in an effort to make a modification to, change, in regards to,
About,
provide the opportunity for, let, it is requested that you, please, in the event of, if, this room's doing really well, and after this is accomplished, then, good job. I hope you all did as well as the room here. So yeah, definitely look out for these. It's really, really common. I do it all the time and I laugh at myself when I do some of these. So yeah, we'll do another practice on the next slide. This one is definitely the most difficult practice that we'll do because it's going to take everything that I told you with the 6 principles of making things easy to understand. And we're going to try some of them. It's totally fine if you're not able to remember all of them. I have referenced them at the bottom where it says recall. And you can do this how you'd like. You can maybe just try 1 or 2 of these and try all of the principles if you'd like. You can pick yeah, just do this how you like. You can try to use just a couple of the suggestions, all of the suggestions. But yeah, we'll take maybe 5 minutes to give this a go, and then we'll take a look at the answers. So best of luck. Okay, so we thought we'd call in the Zoom to share what you came up with. If anyone wants to come off mute and say their sentences as well, I'm seeing a couple come in the chat, which is great, excellent job. Is anyone interested in sharing aloud?
All right, Brett's in the chat was, the case was reopened because the governor gave a response to the complaint. What do you think about that one?
Nice work.
Yeah?
It's definitely better.
Anyone did something else different with that one?
I just said the governor's complaint was reopened an issue.
I think that's better than mine.
Trainings help people get better writing skills. Don't leave Tom's iron on.
Some of these are better than the answers, so great job.
How about the people in Vancouver? What'd you guys do? They probably can't hear me. You want to ask the Vancouver people?
Any
how-
Vancouver folks have any answers?
Okay, Martha.
I guess not. How about in this room? What do you guys come up with?
I just put the training gives opportunities in writing and
Nice.
skills down.
Nice.
You're really good at this.
Today's blog covers topics of elder abuse.
Nice.
Overdoses can be treated with naloxone.
What was that?
Overdoses can be treated with naloxone.
Mhm.
Kids in the back, what do you got? What did you come up with?
Which one?
What do you want to share? Any of them?
This training will improve your writing skills. The first one.
Nice.
Oh, and the Tom thing. Don't leave Tom's iron on. It's broken and then these will catch fire.
Nice. Yeah, that was really good. Okay, so we can look at the answers. In all honesty, some of your answers were better than the answers, so that's really, really great.
It's great. All right, are you guys ready to see the answers? Wait for it. Yeah, this is fun. Yeah. Okay.
So here's the suggested answers. Yeah, I will say what I really liked about some of the answers that we heard was people were really great at getting the right, like the main points across and taking out some of the filler words. So I heard like taking out the word accessible was a really great idea. Switching unattended with like alone or something, like there was another word that used there. And that sentence was shortened even more, taking out a sentence that maybe wasn't really useful for the meaning. So I really like that people did that. I thought that that's such an important skill to be able to do that. So that was really, really well done, kind of all around. And yeah, I think probably the most challenging thing is the active voice piece. So having your subject be the main focus, that's something that takes practice. So yeah, definitely just
And the
thinking about
subject
that.
is Tom.
Yes.
It's not me.
Exactly.
Tom's
Yeah.
iron is broken and catch fire.
Yeah, that's way better. It was way shorter. So that's really well done.
Nice.
Okay. So next, we have a tool for this. So this can be really helpful as you're getting used to using these skills. It can help you, just to get used to it. And also these readability tools will give you a grade level, an approximate grade level for what your writing is at. So if you go through a text, you try to make some changes based on accessible writing, you can throw it in one of these and just check where you're at and if things need to be improved. It should be used as a guide, not a confirmation, because these tools will not consider your audience or the purpose of your message. So that's a really important takeaway from using these, but it will help with some of those other principles. So specifically it helps you look for complex language, things that are maybe too long could be shortened. It'll provide suggestions for words that you can remove or replace, and it will encourage you to use an active voice. So the one I like is the one on the bottom there, the Hemingway app, and I have On the next slide, an example of what this would look like. When you
I'm
plug it in.
gonna stop making the screen. Does that ever happen to anyone? Is it just me? When you make the slide big, then it freezes and when you're sharing your screen?
Everyone's shaking their head.
It's never, no, just me. Okay.
Oh, we have one person in the chat saying yes.
Did the person in the chat ever figure it out?
I feel like I had figured it out before, but I
Okay.
forgot.
It's okay. It's not even this computer, it's a new computer. It happened on my own. Anyway, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so this is a text that I pulled from Beautiful Trouble. They put out a lot of guides on really complex topics. So this is an example of a complex topic that maybe you've tried to explain to your peers, which is capitalism. It can be really difficult to explain in accessible language. So this one, when I plugged it into the Hemingway app, it came out to a grading level of 16, which I don't think we have level 16 here, so that's about double what you're looking for. And actually, this will also do a postgraduate, so I'm not sure what grade level 16 is. There's a postgraduate after that level, but anyways, it's too advanced. So,
We have a question.
oh, sure. Yeah, so Cecilia, you have a question?
Oh, yes, it's just that somebody in the chat was asking a question that I'm also interested in. Like she or they said that if linking words can help for some of the sentences we were saying before, like therefore or although, like those, oh yeah, like in this example that you put, the word therefore is highlighted in purple. So is that something we should avoid using and just, for example, just put a point, separate the sentences, or is it okay if we use those linking words?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I know I use therefore a lot. Usually you can drop it. So usually you can just plug in a period and break that into 2 sentences. Usually therefore is used as a filler to make your sentence longer. So in that example, let me go back to that example. If we wanted to say the governor responded to the complaint, therefore the case was reopened, that would be a little bit longer than if we had just paused it at complaint, period, and then the case was reopened. So usually words like therefore, any descriptive words, those can be dropped. Usually you can just replace those with like a period. I hope that's helpful.
Yes, thank you.
Cool. Yeah, and the Hemingway app, if you get, we'll point those out for you. So that kind of solidify that point for you. If that's helpful. So on the next slide, we have an example of a text that I simplified. The suspense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this text was simplified. It's now reading at a grading level of 8. So a couple things that I did to simplify it. The text was already pretty conversational. It used words like are. There's another word in there that's conversational. Most of the edits were to shortening sentences. So there were a lot of run-on sentences, which is really, really common. So
Freeze again.
just plugging in a period. Clarifying words that might be new for readers. So proletariat is not a word that everyone knows. That one can be explained. Even a simple word like labor, like selling your labor. I explained that one, it might make it easier to read. And then contractions were added. So if I am looking for an example, and I can't find one, but instead of like do not, we would say don't, things like that. So I hope that's helpful. I don't know if anyone has any questions, but if not, I'm gonna pass it to Tom for the next section.
Thanks, Kenzie. And my own observation on all that, it's just, I find it funny how we get programmed through different levels of education to adopt certain writing styles, and then we have to deprogram ourselves to make our writing useful again. It's kind of fun. So this is kind of a sidebar again, a little more conceptual than the applied stuff that Kenzie has been talking about. But we wanted to illustrate an aspect of making knowledge accessible that is a real life example rooted in experience that came through the creation of our Climate Justice Organizing Hub Wiki. Oh, sorry, I forgot about that. Yeah, and accessibility obviously has many different meanings. We hear a lot about accessibility in terms of what senses people are using to capture information or providing, image captions and et cetera. But in this case, we're talking about making concepts and terminology accessible to activists and community development folks in order to grow our movements and to make our movement itself more accessible. Because again, here, it's like the opposite of what is valued in society, where in our capitalist society and our knowledge economy society, having rare knowledge, sets you higher up in the hierarchy or is valued. But in movement building, knowledge that is restrained to an informal network or secret knowledge that is held by an elite is actually a very damaging thing for movement building and is a barrier for onboarding new people. And even though some of the new movements we're trying to build are very horizontal, in this case, it was the Quebec student movement around climate justice. They still realized that lots of new folks were coming in and felt very alienated by all the jargon that folks were using, even things like anti-oppression, carceral state, things that we throw around a lot that we get used to hearing a lot, can be very alienating for new folks stepping in, where they feel they should know what this means. And because nobody will explain it to them, they kind of sit quietly at the back of the room in meeting and just try to pretend that they understand what's going on. So it was actually the young activists of the Quebec student movement that came to us when we were building the hub's knowledge base and asked us, could we throw up as many definitions of those types of terms that are always heard of in climate justice circles and try to collectively flesh out what we mean by these things and render that open source and accessible to everybody, especially new joiners. So that what you see on the right column here of the screen cap was the very beginning of our wiki that Kenzie worked on with Isabelle at the hub. And it was essentially trying to catalog all the as many different concepts and ideological terms that we hear in climate justice activism, and at least begin unpacking them and providing at least stubs of definitions like on Wikipedia, and these have all been added to over time. And then added to that, different layers came on top of that. So layers that were sourced from how to do different aspects of climate justice organizing, the tactical, the strategic know-how, even the internal management of groups know-how. This all got, thrown into the wiki, and so now I think it's sitting at 180,000 words or something crazy, like between French and English. It's become a very rich resource, and if we have time after, we can dive into it, because we think it's a great example of knowledge made accessible to activists with the intention of making the movement itself more accessible. So I think that's all I had to say about that. And I'll pass it back to you. And we can always dig back into the wiki after.
Yeah, and actually I'm noticing the time. We said in the halfway point we'd take a break. So I think this is probably a good time to do so. So if you'd like to, we'll take about 5 minutes. We'll come back at, it's 6:49 where we are. So we'll come back at, oh God, math. So that's not hard. 6:54. I did not do well in math. We'll come back at 6:54 for some of you joining from different time zones. So whatever the 54 is, 55 now because it's 6:50. So grab water, go to the washroom, grab food, do whatever you need, and we'll come back and we'll talk about the third principle, which is making it easy to use. Welcome back from your break. We're just getting our slides going again.
Yeah. Alrighty.
Cool. So the next principle, and it's the last one, is making things easy to use. So a really, really high, and I wish I could remember this percentage, but I'm pretty sure it's 80% of research is not actually applied in practice ever. So it just sits in a paper and is, and is never used. So it has a technical term known as the implementation gap, which means turning theory or ideas into practice is often not happening. There's a couple of reasons for this. So just as a few examples, it can be really unclear in really complex papers what your main takeaway is, or even on like graphics, posters can be unclear. Not providing a suggested application or conclusion on how you can use those main ideas. The context for when the knowledge is useful to the audience might not be accounted for. It might take too much time or effort to review and draw conclusions themselves for the readers themselves. So these are just a couple of reasons, but yeah, there's a lot of reasons why this is happening, and there are things that we can do to solve for this.
Can I add one?
Yeah.
A little plug for research for the front lines. We think that one of the main reasons research is not useful is because the research questions themselves are not salient to realities on the ground. So with research for the front lines, all the projects we support, the questions, the methods, all the decisions are being determined by the folks we're supporting, the people in the movements and communities we're supporting, which if the research question itself is determined by those folks and they make all the decisions, that's rendered useful from the very beginning. So I'd invite us all to think about who's even thinking about or deciding what that question is. Thank you.
Yeah, that's such a good point. We're going to swap seats again, actually, because I have Tom on the next slide here, who's going to give us another example of this.
New slide?
Yes.
Yeah, next one. Thanks, Kenzie. And this slide is kind of drilling down on what Kenzie said and maybe an unpacking a bit more of what actionable information actually looks like, using blueprints for change as an example as well. And just as we talked about undoing academic habits and tendencies and language, this is another academic, a strong tendency in academia is to explore nuance and explore yes, but, there's like always an ambivalence to findings, which of course, reflects the research. Things are never black and white. But however, in a community development or activist setting, if something is more or less strongly leaning one way, then ambivalence is not helpful. People don't have time to evaluate, a universe of different possibilities and are just simply looking for informed advice or advice to make an informed decision. So sometimes you have to get downright prescriptive to make stuff useful to folks. And even if you've outlined the how-to, the implementation of things is the extra step that's needed to make that come to life and make it actually useful for folks. And I guess I would say, it's fine if you keep a level of nuance in, but as long as you say you're safest doing this, although some people say this, like this is where most of the research tends to point. Or here's what we think you should do. You actually have to pronounce on and make a judgment call based on research if you are trying to make it useful. So just to illustrate that, when we're starting blueprints for change guides, those would be descriptive. First, describe how people put together different tactics or practices or strategies. And a lot of folks came back and said, yeah, but I still can't see how I would actually do this. So we had to build in a separate section, which was set up in stages, which is quite literally like an assembly manual that you get, with a piece of disassembled furniture. It's like, well, here are the steps that other folks took. This came first, this came second. And then, we realized that even there, like, folks were saying, yeah, well, we tried this, but then this happened. And to make it even more prescriptive, we created a tricky parts or like troubleshooting section. Like you might run into this kind of problem when you're doing this, and here's how people have solved for it, because all of that, makes this more replicable and more replicable by people who haven't had direct experience doing this in the first place. So just showing the degree of prescriptive that we had to get to make our guides useful in the end, folks. And this was all based on tons and tons of feedback from activists and campaigners around the world who looked at these things and told us how to improve them. So I hope that is helpful. And I think that's back to you, Kenzie.
Musical chairs.
Next slide. You ready for the next slide?
Yeah.
I thought I fixed it.
It's okay. Yeah, so for this next section, we thought it would be helpful to brainstorm this together as a group. I know some folks are not joining from Research for the Front Lines from that team. So you might not be able to join the group brainstorm, but if you'd like to just do an individual brainstorm on your own, it might be still useful to listen to how folks here respond. But we want to think about, since most of us are working with the same or similar audiences, what it is that audience looks like, what they do, what they're interested in, try to paint a picture of what might be useful for them. So we wanted to start with who we want the knowledge that Research for the Front Lines prepares and shares to reach. Who are these people? And we can do this by defining our intended audience. So we can start with just what comes to mind when I ask, like, who is the Research for the Front Lines audience? What are some words that come to mind when I say that? You can also leave words in the chat. Grassroots, yeah. Land defenders, I see in the chat.
I'll just share that like every different project has a different audience. Like ICA is putting out a big, report on climate policy. There's another report coming out on lessons learned from around the world of rights and nature movements and what strategies work. So each different project has a different audience. So it's hard to, it's like, I think it'd be specific. And I mean, this is something that each project thinks about individually. Is like, what is that? What is their audience?
Yeah, so maybe we can choose one of those because those are going to be really different. Like a policymaker document is going to be really different than a document that you throw out for someone who's a frontliner. So does someone in the room or the chat want to just pick an audience and we'll run with that for this example?
Or Marlene on the side, who's the audience for your documentary? Would you want to talk?
The audience for my documentary would be the pitch for my film, Systemic Racism, and how us as what citizens we live this. So I put the documentary out, I didn't even know I needed it. And it was done before the pandemic, but it's research, it's done specifically just for, somebody had asked, instead of knowing more about the pursuit, they want to know who I was, where I'm from, what's about me. So I just said I was from Smithers. I was born there, and it carried out that it talked a lot about 215 children, my parents being where they were.
People on Zoom can't hear you.
Yeah, so it was very helpful for the work that I do right now. I didn't even know that it would be.
And who do you want to watch the film when it's out?
Now I want the world to see it.
Okay. How's that for an audience?
It's pretty broad. But when we're doing this, you can also think about different audiences and how we can bring those together. So it can be useful still if you're trying to define what might be useful for people, if you have multiple audiences, to define those individually. So we might think about if we want like land defenders or frontline communities specifically to be one of those audiences. It doesn't have to be the only one. We could also think about just people who generally care about the environment. Maybe that's an audience that we want to watch this.
So
Yeah.
now I get it. So what I would
Mhm.
say that I would retract that, just more say non-Indigenous people to
Mhm.
understand what it is for us, right? So that would be the better answer.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Just sharing that with the people in the Zoom. So how would you go about thinking about that audience?
Mhm. Yeah, so there's a couple of questions that we might want to ask, and some of these might be humorous to to apply to that audience. But when we think about what that audience might care about, if anyone wants to throw out some examples of what a settler audience might care about.
White supremacy.
Yeah. Unfortunately.
Assuming that they're watching this movie, then they want, I would guess, to be better allies.
Mhm, mhm.
That's a good one.
Yeah, to be better allies we have in the room here. We have activists here, so missing and murdered women and girls activists, folks who are advocating and taking action on Indigenous issues.
So it'd be good for resources.
I can think of a very, very specific audience.
Hmm.
Okay.
So the audience for the research that's been going on about the community industry response group. So I think you might have to let the Zoom people know, but that audience is like general Canadians that we want to fight for the abolition of the curb.
Okay, yeah.
So, I don't know who general Canadians are, but that project has a very clear goal. I
Mhm.
don't know if it has a clear audience.
Yeah, I think there's similar audiences. Like when we go back, and it might be helpful to just go back because there's, to be fair, there's a lot of probably settlers in the room and probably on Zoom. If we go back to like why we started this work, I think that's a great place to start about what we might care about, what we might be doing in our daily lives, people that we want to be activating further, people who might be not as activated as maybe we are at this current time. What are the things that they would care about? What would be useful and applicable to them to activate them to get them to do the things that we're hoping that they'll do when they take a look at our report, when they take a look at our research findings?
I'd say, I don't know if it was a question, but I'd say like maybe dismantling the good Canada myth, because I think it's a big one, like just realizing, oh, okay, no, like we're not like all good.
Yeah. So kind of like the learning piece, trying to, for folks on Zoom, we had a response saying, yeah, dismantling the good Canada narrative, the myth. What do you think people in their daily lives are doing? What were you doing before you were maybe activated? Assuming we want to activate folks more with the film or with the report.
Marcia's just saying that they can't really hear our conversation in the room, so we do need to repeat questions and answers. Sorry, say that again.
I feel like I lost my train of thought there. So before we got activated, what would me be doing on our daily lives? What were you doing before you were an activist, essentially? If we want to think about just settlers who maybe just care and maybe aren't as activated yet. Yeah, in the room.
I think a lot of people might be, doing like the work home cycle, but then trying to do more like individualist activities to try to combat climate justice. So like, recycling.
Yeah, great. So in the room here, we just have folks might be doing the work. What did you say? Work?
I don't know.
Just the regular balance of life, but how they're trying to take action on these issues that they're becoming more aware about is typically through individual action. So recycling and doing those things that are unfortunately not very collective in nature.
But I think that's a really important point to raise, because whenever I hear folks talking about we're going to target the general public and bring them to a new consciousness, there's like a vast overcalculation of how much time that people have to give to acting on an issue that even they care about. And so when I think of a lot of the cool things I saw coming out of the reconciliation dialogue for everyday people, were lists of, here's 15 things you can do to start your journey on reconciliation, like watch an Indigenous produced movie, read one of these books by an Indigenous author, like small things that people can take on to begin the journey and fit into their everyday lives. Because let's face it, most people, are doing work, home, kids, whatever else, and they're dealing with the tiny bit of time that's left on the side.
Yeah, and that just kind of sparked another idea for me, is like, we can even just break up the idea of settlers further. So we have like settlers who have kids. We have settlers who are working in a specific profession. It can be broken up in a lot of different ways, and we can think about probably in a multitude of ways how their lives might look different, and ways that they might look similar. So some of those similarities might be, that they have limited time, that they maybe would prefer online ways that they can act. Maybe they don't have time to go in person, or it's not accessible to them. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways that we can consider breaking up audiences further. So I definitely encourage, when you're thinking about how your tool or whatever it is can be useful for people, think about the different audiences that you're trying to reach. Define, if you can, what their lives look like, what is going to be accessible to them. And that's really going to help you get to that piece of what is going to be useful to them and applicable to them from your main findings. And again, we want to get that in as few words as possible. So I guess the trick there is, if you have multiple audiences, how can they kind of converge? What similarities do they have? So I hope that was helpful. That's kind of the best we can do for this usability piece. It's kind of the best practice, because in actuality, it's going to take a lot of practice. It's going to take probably some feedback from different people on whether something is useful. Like Tom was saying, with the Blueprints for Change work, is hearing from people who are in your target audience, whether it meets their needs and can be used.
One thing we've been doing a lot of is like community peer review stuff. So before you actually publish something, send it to the people you're actually trying to communicate to, and asking them what's coming across well, what's not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just in case anyone didn't hear, but I think that was heard. So like a peer review kind of situation is really, really helpful. So going to that audience who is going to be using that resource and asking them, is it useful? Is it meeting their needs? So at this time, we're good to summarize what we've shared. And I don't think this summary does it justice, because it was a lot, but we'll do our best on the next couple slides. So actionable knowledge essentially is providing suggested uses. So making your writing actionable, you really want to answer two questions, which is, what is the thing you're writing about? What is it? And what can you do with it? So what's the application? You'll want to consider your audience's context, their needs, and that'll help you to answer potential uses and directions. And then to make it accessible, you'll want to, this definitely doesn't do it justice, but you want to shrink down all the information in its complexity and length as much as possible, and try to make your main ideas pop, so people can find it in limited time. And then we have a checklist, because we love a good checklist. So if this is useful for people, this more or less takes everything that was shared, all those different skills. And this is something you can go through to check your writing, check if it's meeting accessible and actionable standards. But again, certainly this is just a starting point. I think it's a really important takeaway that we gathered from discussion is reaching out to that audience and asking for feedback is going to be super important to make sure that it's useful. Because if we reference again that, like, I'm pretty sure it's 80% of research not being used point, even if you're not using research, just the idea that like your resource might not be used if it's not meeting those needs and it's not thinking about your audience is such an important takeaway. So definitely make sure that in addition to doing all of these things, that you're going to your audience and you're asking them for feedback, you're making sure that it is really meeting their needs. And so with that, we are on to questions. So we have about 15 minutes remaining for any questions that folks have.
You just start with people in the chat in the Zoom.
Yeah. And we might have missed, I hope we didn't miss any questions, but I see Cecilia has, no, that's a clap. So thank you. But if anyone has any questions.
We got several, yeah.
Okay.
Melody and.
Yeah, I think it was Melody that was first. So if you want to go first.
Yeah, I can. First, thank you for this amazing workshop. My question was more about like how to make knowledge, or I don't know, like any type of communication accessible in terms of like where it is shared, like the spaces that you think are accessible, and also maybe the ways we share things, like not necessarily a text in like a journal or media or whatever space we can think of, physical or on the computer, whatever, but maybe like different ways of sharing that knowledge as well that might be more accessible. And again, there might be like time issues, as we talked about a little earlier, but yeah, I just wanted to hear you on that. If you have any ideas?
I love this question. I love this question. So yeah, and I'm really glad that you're thinking about this, because I think it's a piece that we didn't necessarily touch on. So there's a lot of pieces to accessibility that weren't captured in this workshop. So certainly when we think about like the accessibility of an actual document, there's a lot of pieces, and we do have on our Hub Wiki, it would be great if we could pull up a link. I'm not gonna have a direct link, but on the Hubs, I think actually, no, I don't actually have one. But on the Hubs Wiki, we do have a resource that's called Making Your Activism Accessible, and it touches on some of these principles, like thinking about color contrast is a really big one that so many of us make mistakes on. So color contrast being, yeah, a really important principle. Things like, yeah, formatting things, things like, will your document be legible by a screen reader, for example? So these types of accessibility are really important. And I would say in terms of where you share something, that's also really important. And I think the biggest takeaway is share it in as many ways as possible, and definitely thinking about where your audience is. So for example, if you have, if your audience is older folks, you're probably not going to want to just share something online. Not that some older folks are not online, but probably there's going to be better spaces where you could share that, that are going to be more applicable and more likely to reach that audience. So, and that's a really great place to ask that audience, like, where is it that you're frequenting? Where will this information reach you best, to meet their needs and to be accessible to them? But definitely sharing information in as many ways as possible is really, really helpful, pretty much no matter what. So sharing it on different platforms in different formats is always helpful. So at the Hub, for example, we have our wiki, which is great, and it's got tons of information, but we recognize that not everyone's going to go on there and reference those articles. So we try to share that information other ways, like on our Instagram page, and just, you know, letting people know that we have that longer form article available. We do workshops on that content so that it's more engaging. People can have that on the background if they like. They can engage with the content. So yeah, just thinking about different ways to present the information is always really helpful in terms of accessibility. But if you do want to think about those specific principles like visual accessibility, that is on our wiki page, which I definitely recommend checking out, because unfortunately, accessibility is a really big topic, and there's so many things to think about within it, that can't be captured just in the workshop alone. But yeah, it's a really great question. Thanks. And I see Anu has their hand raised.
Hi, thank you for the talk today. I'm like, this is my first meeting, so I'm like a little bit confused. So pardon me if my question is like too vague. Like, we are trying to bring awareness, correct? And it is for it's not for a particular group or a particular community. It is for everything. So there will be like a specific topic, and then there will be activists for that particular topic, and we go from there. Did I understand that right? I can't hear.
thinking it's a volunteer.
I could just answer that the way research for the front lines works. Is, yeah. So we're a network of folks across Canada who support research that's led by communities and movements that are fighting for environmental climate justice. So we have right now about 20 different projects on the go, and we have a network of about 140 researchers who volunteer their time on research projects. So that's why this question is super important, because sometimes we have like, you know, Indigenous and other community folks out there who are saying, hey, I need to look this up. Can you look this up? And I need that information. Can you write me a little report? And if we're writing a report that's just like full academic jargon, because that's how we've been trained, that's not going to be useful. So this particular training is to try to build our skills to write really accessibly, so that the work we're doing in service to communities and movements is immediately useful, and we're not having this barrier of jargon. So that we have a training every month about this one, and particularly is on accessible communication. But we've had other trainings on other kinds of research-related skills. But yeah, in general, research for the front lines, that's what we do. But I think in general, regardless of what kind of research you're on, these kind of skills are really important, especially in this moment in time where it's really important that the research we're doing is contributing to some kind of change.
Thank you. Thank you.
Also, just to solidify a point, because I fully forgot something that we have to make that guide that I just mentioned more accessible. The Making Your Activism Accessible guide is available on the Commons Library. So if you'd like to just type in the Commons Library into Google, you will find that guide there under the Global Grassroots Support Network. So that's just another example of sharing something in different places so that it reaches more audiences. I can't believe I forgot that. So yeah, hopefully that's useful for folks.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? We have one in the room here.
I don't know if this is, yeah. Curious if you have ever noticed like particular pitfalls that people fall into when they're trying to do this work for the first time.
Yeah. So the question was just, are there any particular pitfalls that people fall into when they're doing this work for the first time? I can surely speak to that because I also did these pitfalls at one point and still do. Like I can speak to the ones that still come up for me. So run-on sentences is a big one. And it's, in fairness, probably one of the easiest things that you can start with is taking a really long sentence and shortening it. So I would say if anything you take away from that, please take away that, because that comes up a lot. Filler words too, like the question about whether the word therefore is useful. That's such a commonly used word in academia that I still use, and I try to catch myself because usually you can drop it entirely. I would be interested to see if there's a situation where you can't. So I definitely say those. The active voice is a difficult one to practice, and for sure, like I won't usually get it on my first go when I'm fixing something. So it's usually a second time around that I get that. And oh my God, formatting in terms of blank space is a really big one. So like I mentioned, we all want to just put as much content on, say, like a poster as we possibly can, and it makes your main takeaways so impossible to find. So it's really important to have information that people need, but you can also do things like link via barcode if people want more information. If you have a website, you can throw information there, or yeah, just like a separate like pamphlet where people can get more information on your action that's like attached to it or something can be really helpful, so you're not just loading people up with so much information. So yeah, blank space is a really big one. I would say those four are probably the biggest ones that I noticed. Okay, we have more.
Yeah, so to carry on the pitfalls piece, too much information, like laying out all research that you have on something, like that makes things non-actionable because people just start to get confused with all the data that they're processing and don't really see the clear line of what they should do with things. So we have to like always ask ourselves, is this extra dimension that I'm bringing with this extra paragraph, does that really help, or is it really necessary to act on this information? And oh yeah, Kenzie, and my thing that we often have to struggle with is getting like lists of links, and all the information is in these links that you have to then follow to open a second report and read the whole thing, rather than saying, you know, this report actually provides some great stuff, and giving 5 to 10 bullet points from it, so people don't have to do the work of following a link and reading further about something.
Yeah. Another question in the room.
So two somewhat related questions. Number one, quantitative data, AKA numbers. How do you?
Thanks for transit. Yeah.
How do you? I mean, what are your kind of approaches? Because I find, of course, it's very effective. You want to have these killer numbers. Often, if I'm reading a report or something, I'm like, what's the takeaway? Where's the number? Where's the magic number? So, one, that's my first question. Any guidelines or points on that? Two, when using numbers, I struggle more with this nuance and the subtlety question, because you're kind of making a strong statement, using a number makes it more difficult to not be transparent about the caveats, which I struggle with the whole subtlety thing anyways, because you don't want to be accused of misinforming. So those are kind of, the two somewhat related questions.
Yeah, I totally forgot to mention numbers. That's a really common thing that we're working with. So yeah, simplifying numbers is definitely the key takeaway. So anytime you have a number that is like not just like 80 or, you know, like a 0 or a 5, you want to round it. That goes for like percentages. So like about or nearly 85%. If it's 83%, that's going to actually, for whatever reason, going to be easier for people to grasp. When you're writing numbers, don't spell it out unless it's a really long number. So if it's a number with like way too many zeros, it's totally fine to just say 1,000,000. But if you're dealing with a number like 80, it's easier to just literally write the number 80 opposed to writing it out, like spelling it out. And so, yeah, just rounding and thinking about ways that you can package numbers in a way that's going to be easier to grasp. So if you have like a specific percentage, sometimes it can be more useful to say like 3/4 or like 1 in 10 people or whatever it is unit you're thinking about. So yeah, thinking about ways that you can package numbers that might be easier for people to grasp. Yeah, I find that like thinking almost like the pie chart, like a 1/4 is usually more useful than 25%, depending on the audience and depending on the context. But if you say like 1 in 4 people, that's usually easier to grasp than like 25% of people, if that makes sense. And your other question was about like how we apply numbers to usability. Is that kind of your question?
I think it was more like, you don't want to take away nuance and the subtle like complexities, because you could be misinforming people. So how do you like allow enough subtlety and nuance and complexity in your communication so you're not accused of misleading people, but also make it accessible? I was gonna say footnotes.
Yeah.
Like put the nuance in the footnotes.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's fair to draw conclusions, and I think it happens often. But I think if you're transparent, like with things like approximately or about, or it's suggested that, like phrases like this, where you're not kind of on the hook for saying that it's a fact. And we use it in science all the time, right? We don't really say like, this is a fact. We say it's suggested that, or research points to, or things like that. And yeah, trying obviously to make that as actionable as you can. I don't know if that answers your question or if you have anything to say, but honestly, I don't work with numbers too often, so.
I mean, I have a half-formed thought on that, and oops, sorry, those darn wires. Yeah, I think that like, especially thinking about the climate space, where there have been so many numbers put out for so long, and then we think like, what is actionable in all of that? At what point are numbers really leading us to a takeaway, or just adding to the surfeit of information that we have on something? Like, I think when we talk about actionable numbers, they're often contrasts, so the federal government is spending X amount on climate mitigation. Meanwhile, fossil fuel subsidies are 10 times higher, something that shows a clear power imbalance that, shows something that clearly needs to be changed. I think that there are too many numbers out there and that people start to lose focus and go away from action when exposed to too much data. And that kind of resolves the question of how subtle are we? Like if it's a question of subtleties and well, maybe it's not actionable numbers, like maybe if you have a very clear smoking gun type of number that really points in one direction, that's the one to go with, and you don't need to be so subtle about it.
I think we have one last question here in the chat, in the
Sure.
Zoom. You see the one from Melody? Maybe you can see it. It's up there.
Yeah, and I also see we're at 7:31. So folks are dropping off, and thank you for joining us if you're dropping off. But I will respond to the question, which is up here. I feel like words like therefore can be very important in other languages like French to help readers make links between one piece of information and another, such as make clear what causes what. I am not a native French speaker, so I don't know if I can respond to that without knowing French, but what's your take on?
Yeah, I'm like,
It's a very small comment. It wasn't like really a question. I was just like sharing my thoughts. So that's fine.
I was just thinking about that sentence that we used as an example, and I think that sometimes we have to give people credit that they'll see causality if we put two statements next to each other, like what was it, that the judge and an action happened and then you follow with another. I think that people read causality into that, at least in those two English sentences. So I don't know if that answers that.
Yeah, thanks for that though.
Should we close her up?
Yeah.
All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us here at this training. We have another one coming up next month, also on the theme of communication, and that one's going to be on public speaking with this really incredible speaker from the US named Sam Grant. And he's going to be talking about how we do public speaking in a way that really takes into account who we're talking to and how we want to connect with them. So that's check out our website for that. And thank you all for coming. Thank you to our partners. Thank you to Tom and Kenzie for this. And we're going to close up the Zoom, but we will be sharing the recording for this on our website on the resources page, as well, hopefully the slides. Yeah, and the slides. So those checklists and stuff could be useful there. So feel free to check that out on our resources page on researchforthefrontlines.ca. And thanks again. Bye, folks.